agree on. I also, the CRT piece, how critical, probably a funny word there, how critical is critical race theory in the sense that I'm a big believer that we have systemic racism in our culture. And when I read the literature and the stories all the way back, we used to exchange these on Facebook too. Some great books when James Baldwin and Ta-Nehisi Coates and all the people that have done a really good job of capturing their specific plight in story form. Obviously, Medgar Evers and MLK and Malcolm X and all the leaders of this telling their stories and being very prolific in their writing and sharing of story, because narratives create an understanding in our culture, right? Yep. And for me, I have so many friends, conservative too. And I'm not talking like Trumpers, but conservative people that just don't believe that white privilege exists and that there is no systemic racism. And the arguments are right off of Fox News. We have a former president that was black. We have executives that are black. We have, a secretary of defense today that is black. So it's it. We're good. You're like, no, we're not good. And not on any front. And what I didn't realize until I started diving into literature is that critical race theory isn't just about the legal discussions that formed by, Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell in the 70s as legal scholars to discuss.
Yeah.
It's also about Latinx. It's also about Asian. It's just any type of minority that is oppressed is part of that program, right? So just for any listener who isn't, what we're talking about critical race theory and where the debate is in the news, critical race theory is a legal scholarship that founded in the 70s by Kimberly and Derek Bell. And she actually founded the term, I think, Kimberly Crenshaw. And so it was a bunch of legal scholars, people of your ilk, pontificating about like, hey, this is wrong. And this is, we need to fix this. And we need to identify these things. And we need to find remedies for these things. And we need to do this. And that started in the 70s. And it pretty much remained at that level, right? High-end academia, scholars and people of letters talking about this as a necessary reimagining of how we view the population, how we deal with the problems based on all of these pieces. What you see in the narrative today, specifically from the right, is that we're teaching this to K through 12, which is not the case at all. But what I did find out is that there's mechanisms of critical race theory that are now in the criteria and the syllabi of teachers. So it is being taught. It's just not critical race theory is so academic that it can't be taught to my son, who's, I have two kids, they're 8 and 9. So they're not teaching my little boys critical race theory because if it doesn't have somebody with Legos or Iron Man, they're probably not interested. And so there's those two pieces just to like set the table.
Yep.
How do you as a progressive see, and maybe let's just focus on one aspect that I have, because as a corporate coach, I have executives that I coach.
Yeah.
A lot of them are dealing with intersectionality. So we could just focus on that piece maybe as a starter. The problem that they and I have seen with that kind of goes back to another woman who's in the zeitgeist, is Robin DiAngelo's book, which we both talked about and read.
Oh, yeah.
White Fragility. And not even admitting, but opening up a lot of these intersectionality training courses by telling folks in the room that we are all racists. And I will admit that I have implicit bias on race. I just have. I grew up with my parents. My dad was a bigot. My grandparents were bigots. And I think my dad was pretty much a xenophobe, but he thought he was better than black people for sure.
Yep.
And my mom was Mexican. So I don't think whether he thought he was better than Mexicans or not, I don't know, but she was adopted. So she wasn't raised in the culture, but I digress. So when you look at teaching this to corporate executives, and maybe that's the only experience I have right now, is that they're on their heels. They're like, wow, you walk into a room full of really powerful men and women and tell them they're racist. That's pretty much the end of the story, right? It doesn't go over well. And in certain educational institutions in big corporate America, I think there's 26 out of the Fortune 100 for sure that are teaching intersectionality training, and I got that data from Christopher Rufo. And we are teaching this in our culture. So the approach to me seems wrong. And it kind of goes back to the defund the police discussion. I think if we had a polite debate around things, I think we could solve the problems much easier. What do you think of intersectionality training? Because I think we can agree that the purpose of it is the right thing, but how it's being discussed and how it's being taught seems to me problematic. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so I wanted to say one thing. You know how you said pilot program for rethinking about police? There is one. I know of one program in Oregon. I was trying to look it up, but I'll find it and I'll send that to you.
Thank you.
As to see it, because it is a very successful program, and it could be something that we can model off of. But in terms of CRT and in terms of intersectionality, I just wanted to add one thing. So I think there's three ways I define CRT. The first way is a very technical academic way, which is legal scholars talking about how legal institutions reinforce racism and how it's normal. The second aspect of CRT would be MOK, really all the narratives by scholars, by activists that have essentially taught us essentially narratives against white supremacy. So Chicano studies, African American studies, all these things, Native American studies, indigenous people studies. So that's the second one. And then the third one is culture, how people define it, how people say, oh my God, you're learning about MOK, that's critical race theory. So
you're learning basic history. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's why when you look at the Texas statute that came out banning CRT, they removed Native American studies, they removed MOK, they removed
Chinese and the Japanese internment camps, all that.
Whenever the founding fathers had essays about slavery and how it was wrong, we can't even learn about the KKK, about how bad they were.
Right.
So that's
is this just isolated to Texas, by the way, or is this? It sounds very Texan.
It's very well. We do know that it was a Texas statute that was just enacted. I haven't looked at, but that was probably the most popular one that I know of. I did hear you say Chris Rufo. So that guy sucks. And the reason why I say he sucks is because he is the leading advocate against CRT.
Oh, I know. That's why I've done my homework on him, because I'm trying to get the other side, and that's a piece I think we were talking about earlier. Is for me to understand, or for me to do anything of value, I need to understand the other person's purview, and that is huge. And Christopher Rufo is a very educated person on this area. He's a journalist. He's a thinker. I don't necessarily agree with him, but the guy's done unbelievable homework. I mean, it's not like he's actually done records requests.
I think he's being incredibly disingenuous, and I think he has a political agenda for CRT, and I think that's why he's rather than actually talking about the first two definitions of CRT, which is academic, and actually
you're right. He's talking about
creating this whole narrative that it's in our schools, that it's and a lot of people would argue that once you follow the money, it's actually a way to promote homeschooling. But that's a whole other thing.
No, that's cool. I would just say that the reason I bring Christopher Rufo into the discussion is that it's the same reason I would bring Ben Shapiro into the discussion. It has nothing to do with the fact that I look up to them or
Of course.
It's just that I because they're thinkers, and those are the thinkers that are being paid attention to by the right. And so for me, I need to understand. If my friend says, have you seen Christopher Rufo? I'm like, no. So then I looked him up and I was like, oh, okay. And
to be objective and to, of course. My buddy, he actually had a debate against Charlie Kirk. And they talked about CRT. So I'll share that.
I thought we were good. Yeah, we saw that online, because Charlie Kirk, I can't get my arms around. I try to see, he maybe has this point. I'm like, no, he doesn't.
But he actually conceded. He conceded that the technical, the academic, the first definition of CRT was actually right, which was crazy.
Wow.
For a progressive.
Good for your buddy. Yeah.
And so they were mostly debating the third one. where
which was
what
the narrative.
culture sees it. Yes, the
Correct.
narrative, cultural
Yeah.
narrative. So I'll share that link as well.
That's
In
cool
terms
for
of,
Charlie. That's
right.
why you can't poo-poo everyone.
But as to intersectionality, yeah, it's tough. I think the really the best way to have intersectionality is to actually be an integrated society, because when we see it, we are it. So that's the best case scenario. The next best case scenario is learning intersectionality in public education. So learning history, as we pointed out, which
Yeah.
includes African American history, which includes Chicano history, which includes Indigenous history, Asian API history. So yeah, so that's our second best approach. And what's happening right now is um, largely white conservative men, and really white conservative people, Americans, are pushing back against learning about intersectionality, learning about non-white people, and in their schools. So that's why we had that Texas statute getting rid of pretty much every angle of intersectionality that they were being taught. Did they get rid of any history on white people? The only history that they got
The bad
rid of,
history. Yeah.
well, no, the only history that they got rid of for white people was when they talked about intersectionality.
Right.
So it's like, yeah. So in terms of intersectionality, I think it's just one of those things where we have to live it, and we have to be taught it. And we're taught it right now because we don't live it. And obviously, a very conservatism response to that is fundamentalism.
Concern, and this is where I think my progressive friends push too far, because the word white supremacy, which is in all of the literature, is an immediate on your heels reaction from people. And so I shared with my buddy in a 2-hour CRT debate, the author and Black DEI consultant. I said, Bud, like, if someone came to me and told me I was racist, I would immediately recoil. It's almost like someone calling me a pedophile. It's a really toxic label. And so I would push against that, even if I was. And then I explained to him an example of implicit bias, where a buddy of mine and I were hanging out in New York City at a conference, and he's a Black guy.
Yeah.
And we saw a guy get out of a Range Rover in the lobby, and he was dressed to the nines, tall and handsome. And my buddy goes, "Is that a baller or a tech CEO?" And I was like, "Oh, fuck. Sorry. I would think he was a baller," right? I mean, it was just my first reaction. And he goes, "Okay, well, thanks for being honest, buddy." And to me, that was an example for me. And this was my buddy being nice, but trying to point out the obvious. Like, we have implicit bias. And this was my example. I have 3 or 4 people already comment on this, like, "You're a racist. I'm not." I'm like, okay, that's fair. But that was just how I was. And
Yeah.
I made a joke. My wife is Chinese and my kids are half Chinese. And so I made a joke once to, I don't know, it was my wife's friend who's Chinese. We were at 7-Eleven and there's a Chinese guy behind the counter. And I saw his poor mom, and that was a racist comment, because growing up in this Chinese family over the last 13 years, I've watched Chinese mothers and my children go to a Chinese Mandarin immersion school. And I see the doting of the mothers, and I see how education is number one, and where you go to school, where you get a job, and how it's more important than where I grew up. Right? My mom's Latina. They don't have the same, focus on education. So I have these biases. I just do. And so that, to me, is when I come up with that on my own, it's easier for me to swallow. Let me just say that. And when someone comes in to teach a class, and I might even start doing this, at some point with my consulting, because it's about the approach. It's if you go in and tell people, specifically white men, I'll just say that, I'm not even white officially, but I am under the moniker of, I get all the privilege of my appearance and all of that. But if someone came in as a consultant that I hired for my team when I was running an ad agency, I'd be on my heels. And I'd probably have to apologize to my team and say, you know what, that didn't work. This isn't going to work. And if I had to have it, because it was mandated by my, we were a small agency. We weren't owned by another company. But if I worked for a holding company, and that holding company said, your agency needs to have this training and you need to put in these continuing education hours, I would do it, but I'd be pissed. And it would push me in the wrong direction, dude. So that's my question, is like, we have to work on the approach. And this is where my buddy and I, the CRT consultant, agreed 100%. We agreed that racism is systemic. We agreed that it's a huge problem. We agreed that our history is not being taught correctly. But intersectionality is one example. And the language that Robin DiAngelo uses, to me, seems really divisive. And it's going to fuck us up.
Yeah.
And that's just that's my purview. And I can be talked off this ledge. To me, that's how I see it.
So that's just one little side note. But as to semantics, as to how we approach it, it's hard for me, because when we're in a position of privilege, whether we're white passing or whether we're white, whether we identify as being white, because it's all up to what we identify as. It's much easier for me as a white man to say, "Oh, you can't say white supremacy," because that affects me, and when we talk white fragility, that upsets me, and that makes me upset, and you can't come at me like that, and I get people have emotions, and I get these things, but at the same time, to me, it's just hard. It's hard to try to figure out a way to be sensitive to white people when white supremacy is not sensitive and actually kills people. And actually it is.
But true, but you think about white supremacy, the immediately what conjures up in your brain is KKK and lynchings and bigotry and death. And so when you go and tell an executive that their beliefs are white supremacy on a foundation of white supremacy, that's what they conjure up in their head too. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that the history itself isn't, it's painfully clear. But all I'm saying is that the approach is very, very, to me, off-putting.
Yeah.
And that's where, and it's the same belief I have in defund the police. It's those words don't fucking work.